Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this programme today we'll be discussing why it's so important to stand up for the Israeli Defence Force in the eyes of the world. Warm welcome to the programme, and I have a special guest all the way from Israel. His name is Benjamin Anthony, a reservist in the Israeli Defence Force and founder and director of Our Soldiers Speak. Anthony, it's an absolute pleasure. Benjamin, sorry. Absolute pleasure, Benjamin, to have you on the Middle East Report.
Thank you for having me.
And yeah, you've got quite an impressive organisation and an impressive background as well. So can you share with us your story? You've come from Leeds and you find yourself on the front line fighting Hezbollah in Israel's Second Lebanon War back in 2006. But can you share with us your Jewish upbringing and why Zionism and Israel is so important to you?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm born and raised in the United Kingdom in the city of Leeds, as you've said. And I was raised there as one of 7 children in the very, very orthodox traditions, where I'm one of 6 sons, and of course there's a daughter there. And during my upbringing, we were raised to be very proud of our Judaism. We were raised to have Zionism as a central aspect of that Jewish identity. And I carried that with me throughout all the days of my youth into young adulthood. At the age of 14, I began my studies at the high school, King David High School in Manchester, which was a 2.5-hour commute on a daily basis, just because that was the nearest high school, Jewish high school, to the city of Leeds. I fell prey, along with my older brother and 2 other siblings, to a brutal anti-Semitic attack that almost killed my older brother in the streets of Manchester in an area called Crampsall, which brought about a situation where my brother had to undergo 3 liver transplants as a consequence of the deterioration in his health from that day going forward. And ultimately, I ended up enrolling in my studies at the University of Manchester when I graduated from high school. I read there history, literature, and politics, specifically American history, literature, and politics. But I was a student campaigner during that time, which saw the events of the Second Intifada. And the Second Intifada was a wave of Palestinian homicide bombings, not suicide bombings, but homicide bombings. Of course, Simon, a suicide bombing would be undertaken with a view to killing oneself. A homicide bombing is undertaken with a view to killing others, specifically innocents. And this wave of homicide bombings that was launched against the Israeli people, Jewish and non-Jewish alike, brought Israeli parents to the macabre situation where they actually had to divide up their children on a daily basis among different buses to and from the same points of departure and return, with the dreadful consideration that if one of their children might be blown up by way of one of these homicide bombings, the other child on a different bus yet might return home safely. And I saw in Manchester how there was near total unanimity behind the idea that the Jewish state had no right to defend herself. And so I resolved that upon graduation I would move to the State of Israel. I did that. I spent a couple of months working for the ambulance service, Magen David Adom, roughly the equivalent of the Red Cross over in the State of Israel. And then I had the high privilege of being drafted into the IDF as what's called a lone soldier. And that took me to the Second Lebanon War. It then took me as a reservist later on to Operation Pillar of Defense and then Operation Protective Edge. In the case of the latter 2, I was dispatched to Judea and Samaria, where I served. I can talk about that as well. And it was a very mixed service. I spent several months of my service in the city of Hebron, which I feel a very strong personal attachment to. And after my service in the Second Lebanon War, the work for Our Soldiers Speak began, and I'd be pleased to tell you about that.
Fantastic. I just want to go back to your university days, because
Yes.
we actually went to the same university. I was a few years before you. But the one thing I noticed was the growing hostility towards Israel on campus.
Yes.
And particularly when I was there in 1996, they tried to ban the Jewish Union because of its association with Israel, and started to see a rise of hatred towards the Jewish people, and particularly towards Israel on campus. How did being at the University of Manchester during the start of the Second Intifada have an impact on you at the campus? And were there a lot more anti-Israel activities?
Well, it had a massive, massive impact upon me personally, and I think actually that it was an indicator of where sentiment towards the Jewish people in Great Britain, or once Great Britain, was actually heading. And I had undergone, or experienced rather, the dreadful anti-Semitism on a physical basis when I saw and witnessed and fell prey to the attack that I mentioned earlier. So that was physical anti-Semitism. But then at the university level, I saw a completely different kind of anti-Semitism, or Jew hatred, which was systemic, institutional anti-Semitism. And the way that that was manifested, Simon, was that no matter the number of buses that were detonated or restaurants converted into killing fields, from the professor to the student, from the professional to the layman, and from the elected official to the voter, there was near total uniformity lined up behind the idea that the Jewish state had no right to defend itself. And I felt that if that is so endemic within the university system, it cannot possibly bode well for what awaits us once these individuals, who are now students, become professionals, become elected officials, become disseminators of the media, become policy advisors. There could not, in my judgment, be a positive future for the Jewish community in Great Britain. I saw it there. I stand by that judgment, and I'm actually of the viewpoint that there is not a bright future for European Jewry writ large. I think that the domino of European Jewry has fallen, and I'm actually not convinced that it ought to be propped upright again.
Troubling times. And Benjamin, you were drafted into the IDF as a lone soldier. Can you tell our audience what a lone soldier is, and what it was like being a lone soldier with native Israeli Sabra soldiers alongside you, and having to learn Hebrew, but also having to learn very quickly the Israeli way of life, particularly when it relates to the IDF?
Yeah, so first of all, I didn't speak a word of Hebrew when I first arrived in the IDF. I was, as I said, raised in the Orthodox tradition, so I knew to read Hebrew and I knew to write Hebrew, but I absolutely was not conversant in it. And that was an experience in and of itself, which I'm happy to talk about. In terms of what a lone soldier is, I think first and foremost it's a misnomer. You are never a lone soldier once you're within the confines or the family, I would say, of the Israel Defense Forces. You suddenly have numerous soldiers who you serve alongside, who invite you home for Shabbat, who bring you gifts from their parents, who bring you cakes and cookies and biscuits and snacks and all sorts of other indicators of hospitality and welcome. And I actually found it a great, great adventure. I think that you have to understand where the term comes from. Lone soldiers is often attached to the idea of somebody who volunteers for service in the IDF from overseas, but that's not actually the source of that phrase. Lone soldier actually pertains to soldiers, first and foremost in Israel, who are in service in the IDF and who do not live within the familial home within the borders of the States of Israel. And that was extended to include these volunteer soldiers from overseas. I was one of the latter group, and I found it a great, great adventure. Learning the language was fun. I have this odd theory within myself. I believe that the language, Ivrit, actually flows in the veins of the Jewish people. We just have to find the experience to uncover it. I enjoyed making the mistakes. And of course, there was the great advantage that being that I didn't speak Ivrit or Hebrew, when our commander would tell us how awful we are and how dreadful we were and how inept we were, everyone else would suffer by way of this criticism, but I didn't understand a word of it, and so I could just get on with my day. So it never bothered me at all. So
share with us what it was like knowing that you were called up to fight against the genocidal terrorist organisation Hezbollah, based in southern Lebanon back in 2006, after they kidnapped and murdered 3 Israeli soldiers from Israel's border, which sparked the Second Lebanon War.
So they actually kidnapped, just to add a little bit of accuracy there, they actually kidnapped 2 from Israel's border, specifically the northern border, specifically reservists by the name of Goldwasser and Regev. And Hamas kidnapped a third soldier, the name of whom nobody exactly had heard of, Gilad Shalit, who was in a tank stationed in close proximity to Gaza. And being drafted there felt like the most appropriate conflict that one could be drafted into, because though that may have been the turning point, the kidnapping of the soldiers in the north, Goldwas and Regev, for weeks and weeks, this is before the days of the Iron Dome, the State of Israel had been absorbing rocket fire from southern Lebanon, wielded at the hands of Hezbollah, that essentially was so intensive that it converted all of the states of Israel from Haifa north to the border with Lebanon into nothing more than essentially a military base. Our men, our women, our elderly, our infirm, our unborn children, our infants had been living below ground for several weeks prior to Israel taking the decision that they were going to launch a ground incursion en masse into southern Lebanon. And so the idea that we were being sent forward to put an end to the source of that fire frankly felt like something that was absolutely correct, and it frankly felt like a high privilege, because to go for me from the United Kingdom, where I often felt absolutely defenseless as a Jew, to being able to serve under the Israeli flag in service of the Israeli state, in defense of the Israeli people, and in furtherance of the Jewish future, was a privilege that was not lost on me. And of course it was a privilege that my great-great-grandparents and my forebears would not have ever dared to have imagined. So I viewed everything through that context, and I'm very pleased that I had the opportunity to see what transpires in war, what does not transpire in war, what's the reality of warfare versus the perception of warfare, and being able to speak to that is something that has served the work of Our Soldiers Speak very well and really gave us our genesis.
Excellent. And can you tell us how the story of our Soldiers Speak began? Because I think it's an incredible story, and particularly you find yourself in the middle of a battle against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, and you get appointed as a media spokesman on behalf of Israel to tell the Western media what it's like to be an IDF soldier and what it's like to fight against this genocidal terror organisation known as Hamas.
So let me just pass that out for a moment, if I may. So I was not in the middle of a battle when this request came. What actually occurred was that all of us, I think it was at the end of the war, we crossed back into the State of Israel. And crossing back into the State of Israel is not this dramatic event. It's not like the parting of the Red Sea. It's literally putting one leg over a barrier and then bringing your other leg over that barrier. And that barrier in this case was about 3 feet high. And we went from essentially enemy territory to the State of Israel, where I instantly felt safe and secure. And at that point, my captain, 24 years of age, his name was Matan, and at 24 years of age he was leading 100 men into combat and out of combat, and brought them all home safely, by the way, and for that I'm very, very grateful to Matan. It's a rare breed that they raise over in the State of Israel. And he turned to me and he said, "Benjamin, there is an interviewer from the Times of London who's looking to speak to somebody who has been in the Second Lebanon War, but is not a political commentator, is not a high rank, but is able to speak about the human side, specifically, not the combat, the human side of what it is to be engaged in a defensive operation on behalf of the State of Israel. You go and you sit for interview." And I absolutely rejected this idea. I said to him, "I'm sorry, but I have no interest in doing that. Remember my context. This was a country, Britain, that had been rather adversarial towards my beliefs and my viewpoint when it came to the State of Israel. And the last thing I wanted to do was to sit down for what I imagined would be an adversarial interview." But he then said to me, "Benjamin, I'm not asking you, I'm ordering you, go over there and sit for interview." And I did that. And during the course of that interview, it became very apparent to me that nobody was actually doing this, Simon. Nobody was speaking without political considerations about what transpired in fluent English. And from there, slowly, we started to witness the delivery of the organization Our Soldiers Speak.
Excellent. So let's have a look at the video now, which is a good introduction to the excellent work being done by Our Soldiers Speak.
On American campuses, hostility towards Israel can be very high. It can be very divisive. Typically, you'll have protests for events, and you hear about this really all over the United States, and it's quite troubling.
To be pro-Israel on some campuses will sometimes mean peer pressure to either abandon your organization or to dismantle it. There are oftentimes protests. There are sometimes other students that stand outside with flyers that have what they call facts on them. There have been instances of what is called an apartheid wall erected on college campuses, and this wall is to symbolize an apartheid within the state of Israel that does not exist.
The campus environment in the United States of America is extremely challenging for anybody who favors the story of the State of Israel today. At the undergraduate level, it's particularly disruptive. It can oftentimes be very, very intimidating. I myself have faced massive demonstrations prior to even making an initial comment during the course of my presentations on university campuses.
Zionists have for so long controlled.
Are you working on that flag on purpose?
Particularly here in the United States, the BDS movement is something that is very negative towards the existence of the State of Israel. And there's a lot of falsehoods being spoken about through that movement.
The enemies of the State of Israel, with all the historic forebears that they have a rich playbook to draw from, and frankly, they know what they're doing. And in order to stand up to them, you have to have people who know what they're doing. Our Soldiers Speak knows what it's doing.
Here on the campuses of the United States of America, there's no better way to combat untruth and fabrications than with pure truth. Our Soldiers Speak is a unique organization in that they're the only non-government organization based out of Israel that brings uniformed, active duty, high-ranking military officials to the United States to espouse the truth of the Israeli military, of the Israeli people, and of the State of Israel.
We match the officers that we bring from the IDF and the National Police to the audiences that we have here. We have the lawyers that's coming to speak at the law schools. We have the doctors of the IDF who coming and speaking here at the medical schools, at the graduate schools.
We bring members of the diplomatic corps to brief students who are pursuing degrees in international relations and policy, and we bring media experts from the State of Israel on matters of security and policy to the preeminent media schools. So we generate on campus the conversation about Israel in the language in which the students wish to discuss the subject from the outset.
We bring them to speak at Capitol Hill for the senators and Congress people.
The mission of the organization is to educate and teach the truth of the Israel Defense Forces, of the State of Israel. There is no shortage of folks in the world who deny the truth, and Our Soldiers Speak is out there to, in fact, keep the truth front and center.
Our Soldiers Speak is bringing future leaders of the United States to Israel, future members of Congress, future business leaders, future leaders of state government, future policymakers.
Cadets from West Point. and we also brought students from 10 different countries.
On our trip, we had students from various European countries. Most of the students are not Jewish. Our Soldiers Speak brings a diverse group of students, which allows us to have a unique perspective and a unique questions because of our combined academic backgrounds.
We traveled throughout Israel, meeting with the experts on essentially every issue on the security and diplomacy front that Israel faced. We were in the north of the country on the Lebanese border, meeting with a high-level IDF commander. We were meeting with a general on the Gazan border in the south. We also met with an advisor to the prime minister. We met with sitting Knesset members, an all-star list of candidates. We could have been congressional representatives coming over in a delegation, understanding the issues at a remarkable level, and it was just a fantastic opportunity.
If people just understood more about the situation, they would gain a greater understanding of it and be able to help work toward a sustainable peace or a sustainable resolution of conflicts over there.
The first thing I wanted to do after I got back from the tour was engage more deeply with our Soldiers Speak. I had the opportunity to bring 2 more speakers to the University of Pennsylvania, both of whom were experts on their relevant subject.
These young folks then go to the Hill and address members of Congress, senators.
Our Soldiers Speak will be expanding our focus to bring about campus events on new fronts, such as in Kenya, in Australia, in Germany, in France, and we will be, of course, re-intensifying our focus once again here in North America as well. The people who are connected with Our Soldiers Speak are already changing the future. They're changing their own future. They're opening their minds to learning more about the state of Israel. They're opening themselves up to experiencing Israel on a personal level. And I think that one cannot help but influence others as a direct consequence of first being influenced oneself. Our Soldiers Speak is making a difference on campus. It's making a difference by bringing select student representatives to the State of Israel, and it's absolutely making a difference on matters of policy when we brief members of the United States Senate, members of the United States Congress, leading policy think tanks and spheres of influence writ large throughout North America. And we're just getting started.
It's great to know that our Soldiers Speak are doing such great work in standing up for Israel, as well as the IDF on university campuses and where it matters most, with governments and with secretaries of state, as well as ministers as well, which is so important. Very impressive video there, Benjamin.
Thank you.
Can you share with us the situation that Israel faces, primarily because you've been in 3 kind of major conflicts, both against genocidal terrorist organisations who do not adhere to the Geneva Convention. They use women and children as human shields. They fire their rockets and missiles from schools and from hospitals and from people's homes, and they are wanting to kill as many innocent civilians as possible. How do you fight a war against these terrorists who don't use what should be traditional military tactics?
Well, I think the first thing that you do is you cleave more closely to your own moral code. You do not, in any way, shape or form, surrender your moral standard in the face of their moral violations. And that's one thing that informs everything that the Israel Defense Forces does and undertakes. With that having been said, within the confines of what's morally correct, and I emphasize morally correct, Simon, because the legal threshold for what's allowed in a war zone is oftentimes lower than what your moral code will ask you to adhere to. But within the moral code of what you're allowed to do, I personally think, and I would like to see the state of Israel move into the Gaza Strip, to take a direct example, and eliminate, and I want to repeat that, eliminate completely, totally and utterly, militarily, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. I do not believe in this idea of what some have inelegantly phrased mowing the lawn, namely giving them the opportunity to strengthen themselves and regroup after a defensive incursion into the Gaza Strip by the Israel Defense Forces. I think that they need to be removed completely, totally and utterly and militarily crushed and destroyed. Now, I want to emphasize I'm referring to the militants, the terrorists of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, but we need to affix a target upon those individuals, and we need to see their routing quickly, speedily, for the sake of the people of Israel, more than 1 million who live very, very adjacent to that fence. Now, in terms of some of the challenges that you have, we can talk about experience such as the fact that 18-year-old soldiers, 18 years of age, who have not so much as been to university, can find themselves in dilemmas whereby they're being fired upon by a gunman, and that gunman is using not a table and not a chair and not a bookcase and not a desk, but a child for cover. And that 18-year-old has to make a decision as to whether or not to open fire, whether or not he or she, in some circumstances, is capable of hitting the offensive gunman and sparing the child. All of these things are attendant aspects of service in the Israel Defense Forces, but the IDF soldiers are very, very different to other soldiers in democratic states. And I'd like to, if I can, take a moment to outline that, because I think it's something that a lot of people fail to understand. Now, if you are a soldier in the forces of Great Britain or the United States Armed Forces, you choose to be a soldier. They do not operate a drafting system. And so you might choose to be a soldier because you are overcome with patriotic fervor. Some choose to be soldiers because they don't know quite what it is that they wish to do long term, and they feel that the military will give them a very good grounding for their future. Some even join the military because there are opportunities to have financial benefits that give one the occasion to go on and study and so on and so forth. There are many, many different considerations, but at the bottom line, Simon, they choose to be soldiers. They want to be soldiers. Now, the soldiers of the Israel Defense Forces are a completely, completely different category of soldier. These are high school students drafted at the point of graduation, more or less, and they go into combat or into auxiliary roles, and they do so with one goal and one goal in their minds, front and foremost, and that is to navigate their way through these tremendous dilemmas and these tremendous, tremendous threats, and to return to being a civilian again, in the case of men, 3 years after the draft, in the case of women, 2 years after the draft, and most importantly, to return to being civilians of good, clear conscience. Good, clear conscience, knowing that they've made the right decision in the face of the dilemmas to which you're alluding during the course of your question. And that informs every step that they take, every fire of the gun, every firing of the gun, every discharge of the bullet. And it's also the reason why no university professor, no journalist, no commentator, no expert sitting in a bureau thousands of miles away has any right, remit, or expertise to critique the soldiers of the Israel Defense Forces, because I can tell you from my experience that those soldiers are making real decisions in real time. They live with the consequences of those decisions, and I think they're actually doing very, very, very well, and they ought to be applauded. They ought to be appreciated, and they ought to be congratulated. And I just want to say one thing about what's going on the Gaza fence on a weekly basis, because I think that this needs to be spoken about. On a weekly basis, there are approximately 6,000 Palestinian Arabs who seek to storm that fence. Now, you've made reference to a term, genocidal. They seek to storm that fence, not with a view to thrashing out the final details of a two-state solution. People who watch this program might wish that these people were seeking to bring about a two-state solution. It's not the case. They're not storming that fence because they want to drive the Israeli people to a negotiating table. They are storming that fence with a specific intention of maiming, murdering, dismembering, kidnapping as many innocent citizens of the state of Israel so that they can bring the state of Israel to her knees. And it's very important that people realize that the state of Israel will never accept that the soldiers will never allow that. And rather than the way that those soldiers are misportrayed in the media around the world, I want to tell you that as somebody who has stood in their shoes, and I have stood in their shoes, those soldiers along the border with the Gaza Strip are precisely the right people, in precisely the right place, at precisely the right time, doing precisely the right thing, for precisely the right reason. They are defending the one and only Jewish state, And I am thankful for them, and I wish them to go only from strength to strength, so that all who care for the state of Israel might continue to be strengthened by way of their deeds.
Absolutely. Got nothing but admiration and support for those brave and courageous women serving in the IDF, and that's why we're doing this programme today, Benjamin. But I want to talk about the kind of misperception of the IDF presented by our mainstream media, and how is it that our Western media outlets ends up reporting the narrative of Hamas or the narrative of Hezbollah, and instead of defending the only true democracy in the Middle East, who's fighting for a very survival, they instead take on the narrative of the terrorists themselves. How do Western journalists who believe they're so educated fall into this very dangerous trap of playing the Hamas game?
Well, there are a number of layers to this. First and foremost, I will tell you that at the university level, there is absolutely systemic falsehood being disseminated and taught about the state of Israel, its emergence as an independent state, its actions as a democratic state, its treatment of minorities within its borders. All of these falsehoods are falsehoods with which people who study are inculcated. They then carry that into their professional realm, and they view the discussion about the state of Israel when it comes to Israel versus Hezbollah, or Israel versus Hamas, or Israel versus the Palestinian Authority through that false lens, and it's very, very difficult to correct it. So that's the first thing. It's absolute falsehood taught at the university level, which bleeds into people's careers, including those who begin careers in journalism, which is, by the way, one of the reasons it's so important to bring such individuals to the state of Israel, because Israel's her own finest ambassador. So that's one level. Then you have age-old anti-Semitism. So that's married up with this falsehood that is taught in the classrooms. It serves well, it fits hand in glove with the anti-Semitic sentiment that many bring to the table. And then you have this notion that the state of Israel is somehow the Goliath in the region, and the Palestinian Arabs are the David, the small, the minority, the unprotected, the ones who require the aid of the world. And when you put all of those together, you get this dreadful dissemination of falsehood back into the news cycle about the soldiers and the state of Israel. And I don't actually see that abating anytime soon. It's very, very bad in Europe. It's very, very bad in the United Kingdom. My actual primary concern is what's going on in the United States, because you have now an emergent anti-Semitic group, particularly on the Democratic side of the political aisle, that is outspoken in its criticism of the state of Israel, that is anti-Semitic in some of the views that it espouses about the state of Israel, and that is going unchecked by the establishments. And if I can just go one step further, if I may, I think that we have to view the challenges of the state of Israel in a very, very broad context, a very clear context. And the Jewish people have known what it is to be driven out of our homeland. We've also known what it is to be expelled, ostracized, and burned by countries in which we have built our homes. But I believe that the area into which we are moving now as a people is an area whereby we find out what happens when various strands of the Jewish diaspora, Jewish communities abroad, affix a target on the back of the one and only Jewish state. And I think we're into that territory now, and I think we're about to find out how sinister that can become, and we need to battle back against it. And that's one of the reasons why Jewish people must first of all shore up their own understanding of the state of Israel and its centrality to their lives, and also accept with open arms the friendship of those who are not of the Jewish faith, but who are very clear-eyed about the legitimacy of the Jewish people and our presence within the land of Israel.
Now, you talked about in the beginning of the programme your experiences at the University of Manchester.
Yes.
Since then, we've seen that so many of our universities, whether it's in Britain or whether it's in Europe or in the United States, find that it's incredibly hostile for any Israeli diplomat to come to a university and speak, let alone someone representing the IDF. So what challenges do you face in speaking of Israel and the IDF at our university campuses?
So we initially began speaking at the university campuses at the undergraduate level, and we've moved away from doing that. It doesn't mean we don't go to the undergraduate level, but it's no longer our priority. And the reason for that is these lectures, which are not Hasbara lectures, which are not exercises in public relations, these are strategic lectures given over by uniformed generals in active service within the Israel Defense Forces. So, Simon, a uniformed general in active service for the state of Israel is not there to justify his or her role. They're way beyond that. They have a strategic overview that has global implications, regional implications, and domestic implications. And they're there to submit that viewpoint for the consideration of the audience. At the undergraduate level, we found that that opportunity was snatched away by overzealous students who wanted to scream, shout, demonstrate, become enraged, and so on and so forth. That's not the best use of our time. So we decided to focus our energies on the graduate level, specifically the vectors of those studying law, international relations, media, and policy. Because if you look at those vectors, law, international relations, media, policy, those are the vectors overwhelmingly from which leadership emanates. So if you take, for example, an overview of the members of the United States Congress and Senate, they have overwhelmingly studied law during their graduate degrees. They then take that into the policy space. The people who want to advise them have studied international relations. The people who disseminate the messages that they bring to bear have studied media and policy and so on and so forth. So that's where we speak. We bring Israel's expertise to global issues for the consideration of the audience. And we find there that we make great headway. But the lectures on the campuses are merely the commencement of long-term engagement with the students. So we go to campuses, neutral ground within the campuses, and we bring the pro, anti, and undecided alike to attend. Then we bring the best of those campuses from around the world, about 15 different countries, to Israel for a law and policy tour that lasts for 10 days, and they crisscross and traverse the entire country. And then we action those graduates of the tour. It's called the Israel Law and Policy Tour, or ILAP. People can see it on our website. We action them when they return to their university campuses as representatives and hosts, so that we can bring our message to ever more students who are willing to listen.
And Israeli intelligence and security expertise are so needed, particularly in Europe in recent years. I mean, we had the Charlie Hebdo attack in 2015 by ISIS, the attack on the Jewish kosher supermarket, ISIS attack on the Jewish Museum in Brussels, as well as terror attacks in Germany, and then in 2017, Britain alone faced 3 Islamist terrorist attacks. And so without Israeli security and knowledge and know-how, our nations in Europe would be in a far worse situation than they are now. But why is this not translated? I mean, as of recording this program, 2 weeks ago, the Israeli Air Force took part for the first time a joint initiative with the Royal Air Force in Lincolnshire, and actually carried out drills and missions together. The first time in Israel's history that Israeli pilots have flown in British airspace, which is incredible. Why are we not having governments speak up about the incredible role that Israel provides in providing that military assistance, in helping security? There's been so many reports recently that Israel prevented major terrorist attacks from taking place in Europe. And yet we see nothing but dislike and disdain from so many European governments when it comes to Israel.
So I think we're getting there, but it's very slow a process. And if I can come back to my work, and then I'll talk about the aspects of information sharing and intelligence sharing. That's what you've just described in your question, absolutely encapsulates our philosophy. Because I'll give you an example. For years, we heard the canard and the falsehood that if Israel would just stop oppressing the Palestinian Arabs, not only would there be peace in the region, but there'd be peace throughout the world, potentially, if we can solve the Israel-Palestinian conflict, misnamed, but named that nonetheless. And the reality is that democracies writ large have found themselves engaged in asymmetrical warfare. Now, asymmetrical warfare, for the benefit of your viewers, means, in the sense that I'm using the term, it means the deployment of a standing military against terrorist organizations. And France is engaged in that, Germany is engaged in that, the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, numerous democratic states are engaged in that. But the state of Israel, Simon, is the only democratic state who are finding themselves repeatedly engaged in asymmetrical warfare against an enemy that's no more than 45 minutes drive from their capital city. So when England engages, they do so thousands of miles away from London. When the United States does so, it's thousands of miles away from Washington, D.C. Israel does it about 45 to 50 minutes from her capital city. And that means that our lawyers for the Israel Defense Forces, our legal team, and they're a vital part of our defense altogether, they're actually the experts on the laws of armed conflict, or LOAC as it's abbreviated to, on the global stage. And so we bring those lawyers to the top law schools. We bring those lawyers to the governments. We bring those lawyers to the Congress and to the Senate. And when people realize that they are engaged in what Israel is engaged in, then there's an opportunity for a dialogue. But it's a slow process, it's a slow burn, and we're getting there. And I think that the joint exercise that we saw with the Israeli Air Force, along with the Royal Air Force, is a demonstration of that. Remember, the students of today will be the policymakers of tomorrow. The lieutenants of today will be the generals of tomorrow. And if you can start to influence their thoughts and their information in a true and honest way at the early stages, that will carry into their professional careers and possibly even beyond.
I don't know if you can answer this question, but hopefully you can. Now, one of the new strategies being carried out by Hamas, but particularly by the Palestinian Authority, is to encourage the IDF to take on Hamas in Gaza in a new military conflict. In order to take the IDF to the International Criminal Court in The Hague and to try Israel for alleged war crimes, which is a complete paradox when you consider that Fatah and you consider that Hamas have no interest in looking after their own people, and the only reason there is a conflict is because they are perpetuating the conflict without refusing to enter into peace or even recognizing Israel's right to exist. How does Israel fight her case internationally if this were ever to take place?
Well, that comes down to, again, the sacred work, in my opinion, of the Israel Defense Forces Military Advocate General's Corps. Those are essentially the legal branch of the Israel Defense Forces, and I would encourage you and your viewers to become familiar with the work that they undertake, because they are a crack team of elite lawyers who are applying the best of their intellect, legal training, and wits against an onslaught that comes from the legal realm that is truly international and all facing, in an adversarial way, the state of Israel. So I'll give you an example of that. First of all, down to the battalion level, our commanders are trained on the laws of armed conflict by the Israel Defense Forces Military Advocate General's Corps. So the legal aspect is an integral part now of warfare. It's not, by the way, an inhibitor to prosecuting warfare. It's actually assistive to that goal. Afterwards, and you talk about taking and trying Israeli commanders within the International Criminal Court, the MAG Corps, the Military Advocate General's Corps of the Israel Defense Forces, launches thorough investigations into any allegation that is brought to bear against any of our soldiers. And the reason that we have such a thorough series of investigations is because when it comes to international law, there's a notion of complementarity. I don't know if you're familiar with what complementarity is, but allow me to express it.
Yeah.
It means that if you as a domestic entity are able to conduct a thorough investigation legally into the activities of your military, then no third party has any legal right or purview to take the file for investigation out of your hands. And the Israel Defense Forces Military Advocate General's Corps has found itself to be expert in that type of investigation, not because they're fearful of the ICC, by the way, but because we are adherent to our own moral and legal codes. I should also answer to you, or let you know rather, that the Military Advocate General's Corps, unlike in other democratic militaries, is entirely separate and independent when it comes to the chain of command. In other words, if a member of the IDF Military Advocate General's Corps gives legal advice or opens a case or seeks to indict one of our soldiers, that is binding legal advice. There is no general who sits above them who can say this case cannot go forward. It is binding legal advice, and our procedures are binding. And all of that, together with the moral code, together with the fact that the soldiers of the IDF do act in accordance with the highest degrees of principle, will keep our soldiers out of the International Criminal Court. I have to tell you something, Simon, I'm not fearful about any of this. The ICC does not have me on the run. International opinion does not have me on the run. I do not sleep uneasily at night wondering whether the moral code of the IDF is going to keep our soldiers in check. I know that it is, and I'm very, very comfortable with what we undertake there.
Excellent. I want to bring in another issue that I think is very, very important, that hasn't, I mean, I'm talking about the rise of Jew hatred. And
yes.
A few years ago, particularly if we saw, particularly in Israel's war against Hamas in 2014, what we saw there was a huge spike in anti-Semitic instances across Europe, and also in Britain as well. But what we've seen over the last few years is that's increased. Despite the fact that there has been no military conflict in Israel. Now, we are seeing really the rise of Jew hatred to the extent that we're reaching the levels of the 1930s and the 1940s. Is this something that Israel was preparing herself for, to try and help bring the Jewish people back from Europe if the situation gets bad? Because we know that when Jew hatred rises, we know that our own society is under threat, our own civilization is under threat, and our own way of life is threatened. What are your perspectives on what you see when you're in London or when you're in Europe?
Well, I think anti-Semitism and hatred of the Jewish people is a centuries-old phenomenon in Europe and a centuries-old phenomenon in the United Kingdom. But I think that it is now becoming ever more of a threat given the changing demographics within the borders of the United Kingdom and other European countries. And this is entirely separate to any discussion about migration, immigration, so on and so forth. This is entirely to do with what the views are of the various components that come to Britain, to Europe, and so on and so forth when it comes to the State of Israel. And in the vast majority of cases, these people, these individuals, these groups, these demographics are not positively predisposed to the notion of Zionism. Now, they're entitled to take whatever view they want when it comes to Israel and our right to be there and our right to exist. And we can debate that, we can discuss it. Obviously, I do not agree with their viewpoints when it comes to calling for the destruction or the removal of the State of Israel. I'm firmly in the opposite camp. That can be debated, but what's happening is, with those increased demographics and changing demographics, politicians have to cleave to and move towards the viewpoint of the people who vote in their constituencies. And so they're very unwilling to tackle this. They're usually unable to tackle it, and they are seeking to really strengthen their political lifeblood by going along with these statements and by these actions and by these deeds. It's not just words. There's violence, there are beatings, there are anti-Semitic acts that go on in synagogues, in the streets, outside businesses that have just a Jewish identity, a grocery store, a food store, whatever it may be. I don't think that that will be abated anytime soon. Now, with regard to the State of Israel, I firmly, firmly believe that this is one of Israel's strategic challenges and strategic opportunities. And I know that everybody wants to talk about Iran, and I know that everybody wants to talk about Hezbollah, and I know that everybody wants to talk about Hamas. But the reality of the matter, Simon, is that the State of Israel has some reckoning to do with itself when it comes to its readiness and ability to absorb Jewish people who will leave European countries to build a life of freedom in the State of Israel, and to give those Jewish people economic viability, professional viability, cultural integration, and so on and so forth. And the reason that this is so very important is that if Israel is able to do that, we will turn ourselves into ever more of a powerhouse within the region and globally, and we will hopefully become a nation that is indispensable. Now, I also want to tell you that the State of Israel is the distinctive and distinguishing factor when it comes to any period of time that we've known prior and the modern day. I don't believe this is the 1930s. I think that the distinguishing factor is the fact that the State of Israel exists And anybody wishing to move there can do so, will be welcomed, and they will be welcomed not in spite of the fact that they're Jewish, but because of the fact that they are Jewish. And that's surely to be celebrated, and I think that's one of the reasons that Israel must prepare itself to absorb and enfranchise the exiles who are ingathered into the modern state.
Excellent. So 2 very quick questions for you before we come to the end of the programme. Benjamin, the first one is, what role can Christians play in supporting Israel and supporting the IDF and showing the morality that you've described previously about the moral code that guides IDF soldiers into battle against these terror organisations?
Well, even though I think that there are many parts of the world, including within the Western world, where the Christian population is under threat and being ridiculed and reviled and ostracized, I think that despite those challenges, the Christian communities managed to speak about the state of Israel, and also social issues, by the way, not just the state of Israel, in a manner that is very impressive to the Jewish people. The Jewish people, when it comes to speaking, because of the oppression and the suffering that we face, we often speak in what's called a minority mentality. Don't make too much noise, don't be too controversial, don't draw too much attention to yourself on issues that are really central to who you are and what you want for your children and your children's children. The Christian community, thankfully, does not fall prey to that. The Christian community is outspoken, it's proud, it's fervent, and it's very, very certain about what undergirds its faith-based support for the state of Israel. So I would simply say 2 things. Number 1, keep doing that. Continue to do that. Do not allow anybody to slander your support by way of saying that you're proselytizing. That has not been my experience working with the Christian community and the Christian Zionist community at all, neither here in the United Kingdom nor in the United States of America nor anywhere else. So do not allow people to tar you with that brash of illegitimacy. And the third thing is, the last thing on this, please become politically enfranchised. Do not confine your support to the state of Israel only to the prayer halls or the churches or to the Bible classes and so on and so forth, but become politically enfranchised. I spoke about the importance of demographics. You're a serious demographic. Be enfranchised. Your legislators will respond to your views.
And very briefly, within 10 seconds, how can our viewers get behind the work of Our Soldiers Speak?
So they can get behind it by way of sharing the word. The website is www.oursoldiersspeak.org. You can contact me personally or a member of my team through that website. We also would be very grateful for financial contributions and investments in the work, and they should be viewed through that lens. It's an investment in the future of the State of Israel. It's an investment in the relationship between the State of Israel and the international community, and just help us to continue to undertake our work with pride, with certainty, and in a manner in which everybody can take the deepest pride. And I thank you for having me and for hosting me. It's been a real honour.
Pleasure. Benjamin, I just want to thank you so much for being my guest on today's Middle East Report. I want to thank you for watching today's Middle East Report. And what we've learned from this programme today is the moral code that underpins the IDF in carrying out military operations against genocidal terrorist organisations, and how we have to stand not only with Israel, but also with the Israeli Defence Force. So thank you for watching today's Middle East Report.
Let me tell you a story. It's a story about a country. It's a story about a land. It's about spirit. It's about our legacy. It's a story about the North, South, and Center. It's about doing things for other people. Because you're a friend. And because they once did. It's a story about purpose, about a vision, about a journey to excel without stopping, to achieve every goal, and even though it may be tough, we raise our heads and march on. It is 71 years of small stories that together wrote the story of one army. Of one nation. It's a success story. It's a story of victory. This is our story. This is the story of Israel.